Thanks, everybody, and nice to see everyone again. It is my privilege to introduce State Superintendent Jillian Balow, who was elected to her second term in 2018. As one of 5 elected officials, her responsibilities reach beyond just the supervision of the state's public education system to many other trust responsibilities, and for that I'm very appreciative. Jillian is also shaping the national education policy landscape and currently serves as board president of the Council of Chief State School Officers and is also a Hunt Keen Leadership Fellow, a very prestigious national educational leadership program. I have appreciated the opportunity to work with Jillian both in my capacity as a UW trustee and director of the Wyoming After School Alliance, where her clarity, pragmatism, and deep commitment to Wyoming's most important natural resource, our young people, is always front and center, and we're delighted to have you here, Jillian. And Dicky, I'm delighted also to be able to introduce you. Dicky serves as the Chief of Staff at the Wyoming Department of Education and is also a city councilman representing Ward 2 in Cheyenne. As a native of Cheyenne, Dicky has contributed broadly to the policy fabric of the state, not only in his role as Chief of Staff, but also as a very active community participant and in his service on many boards and commissions. Prior to serving as Chief of Staff, Dicky was in private law practice in Cheyenne and has also served in contributed many capacities as an attorney as well in his past. So thank you both for being here and welcome.
Thank you very much.
What a great introduction. Thank you, Michelle. It's so good to see so many wonderful friends, and especially those that I haven't seen in a long time, Rachel and Amy and so many others. So thanks so much for this opportunity. We appreciate it.
Great, thanks to both of you for being here, and thanks for being game for trying a little bit of a new structure. For the other Emerge folks, I had a call last week with Dicky and Superintendent Balow, and we talked about, okay, how do we get to this 201 meta level? And they were kind in saying, just start asking the hard questions. We don't need any time to present our agenda or perspective. We just want to be there to answer the hard questions and help ask the questions back to you as well. So we're going to try this style today and see how it goes. Both may chime in on some questions. One may take one question. We'll just kind of see how the flow goes as we go through the morning. First up is, we know that in all of our worlds, but especially in education, you're managing near-term crisis and challenge, such as closing of schools or reopening of schools, and also long-term horizon considerations like cuts to budget, or what does education look like in 10 years or 15 years from now. And so how do you manage both of those at the same time, or at least define the problem that you're trying to work on with one particular set of operational or policy issues?
Well, I'll go ahead and start with that one and just say that, you know, I'm really guilty of people will ask me, what's going on in education? What's the most important issue in education? And my pat answer is always, everything is important in education, and everything is always an issue in education. So prioritizing, and not just prioritizing in terms of what's on the front burner, what's on the back burner, short-term, long-term money, but really prioritizing what most affects student outcomes is important as well. So, you know, I think that during all that's happening right now, one of the gifts that the education system and sort of the fact that everything is important has presented is sort of the decentralized nature of education and education governance in Wyoming and across the nation. So we have, you know, so-called local control, and it's a real advantage to sort of being able to prioritize and solve problems because it's always chaotic and it's always messy. But when we embrace sort of a decentralized framework and know that there are a lot of really great people working on problems, it makes prioritizing not necessarily easier, but it certainly brings the correct issues to the surface to work on in a timely manner.
Thanks. Dicky, you want to add anything?
Sure, thanks, Mandy. I would add that, you know, when you raise the question of sort of defining the scope of those two big problems and comparing them, the enormous fiscal situation and also the enormous pandemic situation, I found a lot more similarities than I did in differences. And the superintendent talked about sort of managing those through the decentralized nature of education governance, which I think is a great point, that top-down management of a crisis this big with so many variables down to the community level just wouldn't work. But one thing I noted with both of these is that schools are the ones dealing with the effects of the pandemic, the actual effects. They are the ones dealing with the effects of the funding crisis. However, they really have they don't have the ultimate control over either of those in terms of legal and policy control. With funding, it's the legislature, and with the pandemic, it's the state health officer. And so I think it's a lesson to all of us that we have to do everything we possibly can to come up with the best plans and strategies to deal with the situations in front of us, but also have to be ready to adapt at any moment, because we don't hold all the cards in any situation. In this situation for school districts, it is incredibly challenging for them right now to try to navigate the pandemic and reopening schools with the uncertainty involved in that, as well as the looming uncertainty of the finances, both of which they have little to no ultimate control over.
Thanks, Dicky. And I'll put a little pin in that for all of you writing your letters of how do we address this dissonance between the decision makers and the people executing that policy or that action. And I think, Dicky, you put it really well that it's hard to reconcile that dissonance, but we have to. It's part of the process. Okay, so another really fun part about education is that everyone really cares about it, whether it's their own children or their own school district or the people they want to hire, who they want to be well educated and well trained. And so what's it like to work in or oversee an area that nearly every single resident, probably every single resident in the state, is a stakeholder of education? Pros and cons.
Dicky, take this one away first.
So I came from law and then joined education when I teamed up with Superintendent Balow. And one thing that really stood out to me is this exact question: the strong experiential connection and emotional connection that everyone has to education that really doesn't exist in any other industry or space that we work in. And so it is a double-edged sword. There are pros and cons to that. I would say probably on the con end, from being, say, an attorney where I have a client come to my office who's desperate, who needs help, gives deference to my opinion and my advice and my counsel. With a teacher or education professionals, everybody went to school. Everybody has a default opinion, and sometimes the Superintendent Balow has mentioned a dogma about what is right. This is how I learned math, so why are you teaching my kid this way? And so the education professionals deal with a lack of deference that I think other professionals get due to the fact that everybody went through education and has such strong feelings about it.
Yeah, and I think that the pros and cons are sometimes the same, right? Like it's a matter of how you frame it in different situations. So Dicky did a really good job of presenting that. I would also say that, you know, we love a lot of different perspectives in a debate, especially a policy debate, because it equates to better policy in the end. But with education and so many different perspectives that are represented in the conversation, sometimes that has a tendency to stagnate growth. And we've seen that in every area of education. And a lot of people will point to the whole institution of education as not ever really making progress, despite sort of tweaks to frameworks or disruptions, that we always sort of tend to gravitate back toward a traditional education institution or system. And so the very pro of having all of these perspectives and people who care deeply about education is also the con, because when everyone cares about it, sometimes no one is willing to kind of step out, understanding how great the costs are if a mistake is made with, you know, potentially a whole generation of learners. So, so there are always pros and cons, but I think that, you know, when you view the pros and cons as being the same and look at the situation and navigate the situation and sort of manage the pros and cons, that oftentimes equates to the sort of the greatest opportunity for growth.
Thanks. And I think that, Dicky, you're right. More and more, there are more areas of our lives that we aren't necessarily referring to the trusted expert in a certain way. Everyone thinks they're the trusted expert, or at least they trust themselves as the expert, maybe we could say. And so what do you do with that? And how do you move that a little bit? So very, very interesting. And you guys probably have more experience than the rest of us in that world of working with passionate people. The concept of equity is really woven throughout the Wyoming Constitution a lot when it comes to education. How are you both thinking about equity now in this, you know, interesting and sort of dispersed time as the school year wrapped up remotely and even looking to next year?
Yeah, you know, Dicky and I had a really great discussion as we were preparing for this. We've had a lot of discussions about it, but just as we were thinking about this conversation in particular, you know, equity has been around, especially in the state of Wyoming, and front and center for many, many years. Equity was at the heart of the Campbell lawsuits that that resulted in our current funding model. And so I think in many ways, you know, that maxim, put the cart before the horse, I think in many ways, Wyoming actually did put the horse before the cart. We got the concept, or the, we struggled with the concept of equitable funding before and in advance of other states. So now that equity has become more of sort of this cultural and moral debate in education, sort of the structural debate about equitable funding has already been taken off of our plate in Wyoming. And even through declining revenues, we're not thinking about those revenues in education declining for one population of students over another. It's declining revenue for all students. And so that is not the case in other states. So it's always been huge, but I think in Wyoming, the equity conversation was just a necessary part of the conversation as a result of lawsuits. And now we can really focus on more of that cultural and moral conversation about equity and think about our underrepresented student populations and what opportunities we can provide to them in addition to and aside from equitable funding. I think Dicky might have a good example.
Well, I would just add that the pandemic situation has also highlighted some different ways to look at equity than we have in the past, where we've looked at, you know, demographics, race, location, things of that nature. Now we're worried about equity with subsets of students who have two working parents or don't have internet at their house. or maybe have teachers that haven't undergone proper training to teach through virtual means. And so that equity discussion has rapidly transformed to those types of students, in addition to the traditional equity subsets that we look at. But just an interesting dynamic that's occurred with all of the virtual learning that took place really overnight across the country.
Thanks, Dicky. And I think you articulate well this concept of redefining the problem, that for 100 years of Wyoming education, we had an idea of what equity meant, and overnight it changes the application of that. And so I think making sure that we're doing that in our lenses as well, of what problem are we really trying to solve and how has it changed in our current environment. Okay, now for a fun / hard question. We don't think of maybe K-12 or even higher education as being political, and yet every policy decision that gets made on funding or process or basket of goods is made in policy, which is political. And so is it possible to take politics out of education, or really any topic that's front and center right now? And if so, how? And if not, why not? And how do we just play the political game if that's what we have to do?
So, I think I always enjoy it when education is not political. And I think that in Wyoming, we do a pretty good job of keeping it not political. But sometimes that national partisan and polarization seeps in. And we see that occurring right now in multiple areas of education. And I guess I'm just going to speak maybe leader to leader and say that managing the politics of education is for me is really no different than how you all manage the politics in your world. And that means staying focused on the substance and really flat out refusing to engage in partisan narratives. But at the same time, recognize the influence that political narratives and rhetoric have on the way that you navigate, maybe not the ultimate decision, but the way that you navigate. So let me just give an example, and I mean it's happening right now, but there's plenty of blame to go around. But reopening schools has, over the course of a couple of weeks, become very polarizing, very political, and very personal. And there's plenty of blame to go around, from folks on one side saying, I double dog dare President Trump to do this, this, and this, and reopen schools, and we're not going to do it. And then we have President Trump and other folks from the administration saying, you will open schools or this will happen to you. That creates immediately, instantly, this really polarized situation and landscape and environment that 3 weeks ago, Dicky and I didn't really have to navigate through, but now all of a sudden we do have to navigate through. And, and kind of going back to that decentralization, here we have sort of masks and closures being a state by state thing, and school reopenings being sort of, now all of a sudden we're trying to make national decisions on that. And it doesn't comport, it doesn't make sense. And so going back, just constantly reflecting on the decisions that need to be made in a decentralized school governance structure like we have in Wyoming, and really trusting in the leaders, giving deference to the leaders in their roles at the federal, state, and local level, and really staying true to the decisions that need to be made for Wyoming students, and keeping the politics as far away from that as possible. And again, I don't think that that's any different from what you all do as leaders in your world. It's just that sometimes in education, it's a little more front and center, like it is today for us.
Dicky, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Mandy, I just want to reiterate the notion of deference. And I mean by that, deference to other elected officials and other leaders and their roles in this process. I think that is key to managing the politics as a leader. And with Superintendent Balow, an example I would give you through her leadership in showing deference is, understanding she is granted by the Constitution with general supervision over public schools and obviously looked at as the leader of our public schools, but also understands that the legislature has been given full authority under Wyoming law to deal with the education funding situation. And so, knowing that, we show deference to them in terms of it is their prerogative, it is within their scope of work, it is not ours. We implement what they decide. However, we know it's a huge issue. We know we can offer helpful guidance on that to them. So throughout the course of her tenure, she has, delicately and professionally engaged in that education funding discussion, I think without crossing that line of, moving into their lane and causing that friction that say like the current administration and the teachers unions are having right now. I think leadership and managing the politics, you have to have a deference and a respect for everyone that's involved in the policy landscape.
So, and if I'm summing that up in a couple of sentences, I think that what Dicky and I could both say about our style of leadership is that our influence is a lot more important than our authority. Our pragmatism is a lot more important than our politics. And our persistence is a lot more important than managing the issues du jour. And so I just, I think both Dicky and I are chronic reflectors of our own performance, of each other's performance. We're quite critical of ourselves and each other. And I think that those are all really important tenets when we're talking Leadership 201. That we realize, sort of the vulnerability that we possess as leaders, and that we bring that to the table all the time, and always look for opportunities. I can look at every single one of you on this screen that I know personally and say, I have learned something from you about your leadership style or about the way that you do things as a human being. And I never, as leaders, we should never ever close ourselves off to thinking that we can make a difference simply because of who we are, the position that we hold, but it's much more about the work that we do together and the influence that we have together.
Thanks, Superintendent Balow. That was very eloquent of influence over authority, pragmatism over policy, and persistence over issues. I think that resonates a lot with what we're working on in this program and thinking about. I have one last question, and then we'll shift it if class members have a couple of questions as well before we break into our smaller groups. And this one kind of shifts back to what is your ask of all of us as the average Wyoming citizen? And when we were on our call last week, we were talking about this metaphor. So class, I'll fill you in. But my favorite day in elementary school PE was always when they had the giant parachute that everyone holds on to in a big circle, and you try to do all these cool tricks with it. And my PE teacher always started by having everyone take a handle and pull back as far as they could. And it pulls the parachute as tight as possible. And maybe one bigger kid is stronger and he can kind of shift things. But really, it just means that everyone's pulling against each other. And then the teacher says, okay, let's take 2 steps in. And then you have this extra fabric in the parachute that you can start to play with. And you can do, cool ripple effects, or you can get all the way under it with everyone in it and capture the air. And using that a little bit as a metaphor, I think we have often been pulling the parachute of the Wyoming state revenue or state budget as tightly as possible for our own purpose, our own thing that we want. And so maybe, especially when it comes to education, what do you think those 2 steps in look like for us, that maybe we can't just keep fighting for our piece of the pie? What would it look like to take a couple steps towards the middle and then do some like really cool tricks?
Dicky, you're on.
Okay, I'll take this. Mandy, I love that that story, because I remember the parachute days too, and I think it's a great way to talk about this issue. When I thought about that, the COVID closures, to me, are actually those 2 steps forward. And I say that because parents and communities now more than ever appreciate the roles that teachers and schools play. And so I think everybody, because of what the pandemic brought to us, forced that recognition on a lot of people that maybe weren't there yet. So I think we've taken those 2 steps in now, and there's a widespread recognition that wasn't there before about the roles of public schools in communities. And so I think we're there, and now we're on to that next piece of, okay, where do we go from here? How do we continue this into the next year, into the next 5 years, et cetera?
And I'm just going to add a little bit to that and say, well said, Dicky. And, no matter how far apart we are politically or geographically or what have you, we can always find that we have more in common than we don't. And so, in this world of education with infinite perspectives on issues, with lots of disagreement, with politics, and with everything else that plays into it, I would just really encourage us to sort of, look beyond the dogma, look beyond the stagnation, and find places where we can move forward together. And so, right now in education, you're probably gonna, and I'll just use sort of what we all sort of know about from the news, and that is education funding. And we have 2 camps that say, keep education funding where it's at or raise it. And if you don't, then there will be lawsuits. And we have another one that says, bring it on, and we're cutting education. And it can't just be those 2 perspectives. There has to be something in the middle. There has to be a way to move forward. And when we try to take some of those hot button issues or the polarizing sides out of it and find what we can agree on, find those places. And the only way we do that is through talking and move forward with kids in mind. I think we can make a difference, and not just in education, but in other areas as well. So I would just challenge each of you to really not necessarily understand the funding model the best you can or take a position on it, but really seek to understand when you're having conversations and constantly be looking for those middle grounds. What do we agree on? Where can we move forward?
Great answer on that one. Let's open up to the group a little bit more, and we'll just kick off because Thea, you already asked a question, and if you need to see this, Superintendent, in the chat window, you can see it, but I'll read it for you. Basically, talking about the whole new virtual school format. So given that there's a huge increase in participation with the virtual school format, how are we ramping up for that, and have teachers receive training on how to use the virtual way, or the virtual education process in terms of keeping the education high?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of people who are really well poised to answer this question in the education field right now. But I will tell you, from a state framework perspective, we knew that there would be lost instructional time. And we worked at the state level to set up training and supports for teachers and school districts just as soon as we could, to ensure that the teachers had the support that they needed, lackluster at best, from us and from others, because it happened so quickly. So now we're really redoubling those efforts to to bring experts forward, to build the expertise and the capacity of teachers and school systems to be able to pivot easier than we did last spring to different types of learning. That feels kind of like an issue to me, right? But when I switch over to the leadership side of it and the reflective side of it, what I see is that some of our brightest students struggled with online. Some of our most struggling students thrived in an online environment, and the same is true of teachers. Some of our best teachers who tried to continue delivering education the way that they did virtually failed. They did not do well, they struggled. Some of our other teachers did not fail. They thrived in that environment. And I think that's a really important moment of disruption for us to reflect on as leaders and as educators, to say, how can we improve our whole system? In public education, our job is to meet the needs of students in a public format, not for students to fit into a public education box. And so as a leader, I think it's really, really important that we recognize this moment. We recognize this new equity issue that is caused by virtual education or blended instruction. We recognize that it's not the solution that maybe we were looking for, but that with a little bit of work, we can make it another option within our public schools. So it's really taking those moments of seemed or maybe perceived failure or success and saying, how can we make that work in our public school system for more students, for more teachers, and most importantly for our communities and the public. And so, you know, again, I'm kind of, I guess I'm taking an issue and trying to move that from a leadership perspective. This is how I've thought about it, and then putting that into perspective, back into some kind of framework for our school districts to work with. I hope that helps.
Great. I think we get time for one more question here. Sean threw one out. Is there a role for the community colleges and the university to play in K through 12 education outside of just creating new teachers?
Yeah, so 100% there's a role, and we're working on it. We actually just updated our superintendents yesterday on Wyoming's Tomorrow, which of course was a failed piece of legislation that was then turned into a task force that is headed by Speaker Harshman, and lots of folks are included in that situation. I think one of the most important roles for community colleges and the university is career and technical education and in experiential education. And so, you know, as we think about the vitality and the strength of our state, it doesn't fall solely on K-12 education or on business and industry or on higher education. It's on all of us. And I think over the last 6 years, especially, we've seen leaders from all of those entities, K-12, higher ed, and business and industry, really come together to say what gaps need to be filled in workforce and how do we fill those gaps. I am particularly, and I'm shifting a little bit now, but I'm particularly keen on the role that community colleges can play, not only in career and technical education, but in other areas as well. If you think about the network that community colleges have in every community across our state, they really serve as a catalyst. And I don't think that we maximize our community colleges nearly to the extent that we should, not just in education, but as being a catalyst for a lot of really great things that could happen in our state.
Great. Well, thank you, Superintendent, and also Dicky, for the comments so far. This has fueled or primed the pump, I think, for the discussions that we're going to move into. We're going to jump into the breakout rooms that we had